Well, good morning. Thank you very much for joining me on this video. I want to talk to you today about transforming a rental unit into an owner occupancy housing unit. Especially these days, we have a lot of property come on the market that's currently rented, and there's a good chance that the buyer is going to want to move in themselves. We see this because property's gone up so much in price, and the investor sees an opportunity to cash in and get some money out. Or in many cases, it was a speculator who bought with the idea of selling it in a short period of time with a lift, and they rented it in the meantime to cover costs. Whatever the case, you put it on the market, you know how to work around with a tenant, they give them the 24-hour written notice and so on. You get an offer, and the offer requires vacant possession. Be very careful how you handle it. There's a right way and a wrong way to go about it, and you can get yourself in a lot of trouble if you don't do it properly. The Residential Tenancies Act provides a provision for you to evict a tenant on a month-to-month basis because the owner or the beneficial owner, the person buying the property, requires it for their own use or that of their immediate family. And let me start by clarifying immediate family. The Act is pretty clear about this. It can be the person and their spouse or their spouse. It can be the person or their spouse's parents. It can be the person or the spouse's children, or it can be a caregiver. Can't be a brother, an uncle, an aunt, a friend. And in the case of a caregiver, it has to be that the caregiver is going to be living in the same dwelling, another unit, probably in a duplex or a triplex, as the person who is going to be receiving the care. So if you have a special needs child, for example, you're buying the unit and you're bringing somebody in from out of town to provide care for that child, and you have a rental unit 2 blocks away, you can't evict the tenant there to provide housing for the caregiver. It has to be in the same dwelling. So, with these things in place, you can use something called an N12 to notify the tenant that you're going to require the property for the owner's personal use. Now, there's something called the Protecting Tenants and Strengthening Community Housing Act 2020 that was just introduced last year, and it requires the landlord, in using an N12, in evicting a tenant, to provide compensation, a minimum of 1 month rent. So it isn't just a nice gesture, it's required now by law. You either give them 1 month rent or you provide an alternate accommodation for them that's acceptable to them. So there you go. And I should also say that when you give the N12 notice to the tenant, it notifies them that they have 60 days from the start of a rental period to vacate the property, but they aren't bound to the 60 days. If they immediately start looking, find a vacant place they'd like to move into, they have to give you 10 days notice, but no more than that, and they can end the tenancy. So you've served the N12, you've given them the notice, the agreement of purchase and sale required you to do that, but when the time comes for them to move out at the end of the 60-day period, they don't move out. They have to, but they don't. What do? Well, you can go through the courts, but it's going to take maybe 4 or 5 months with the backlog in the courts right now to get an eviction order, and by then the closing date has come, and the seller is now in breach because he promised vacant possession and he didn't provide it. What you can do is you can use something that's called an L2. And an L2 is an eviction order that the board can give you that automatically orders the tenant to be evicted. It takes about 4 or 5 weeks to get that processed, much quicker than going through the courts to get eviction otherwise. And you've got up to a maximum of 30 days from the date that the tenant was required to vacate to file the N2. But you can file it before that. So the prudent thing to do is you serve the tenant the N12, and at the same time you file an L2 with the board, and within 4 weeks you get an eviction order. You do that even though you got no reason to believe the tenant isn't going to move out at the 60 days, but now you know in case the tenant doesn't, you've got an eviction order, you can get the sheriff in and get them evicted right away. So there isn't any particular problem with that. But I want to point out something else. You, under an N12, are stating that the beneficial owner, the person buying the property, requires it for themselves or their immediate family. When you file an L2, it's going to require either a declaration or a sworn affidavit on the part of the person who's going to be occupying the property, swearing that they need it for that personal use. So you have to provide that. Now, what else? Are there any other options? Yes. Maybe you can look at an N11. Now, an N11 is a mutual agreement between the two parties. And here, if you have a fixed term, you can terminate right in the middle of a term. You can do whatever you want as long as both parties agree to it. So, the N11 is a voluntary compliance on the part of the tenant where they agree to vacate. Why would they do that? Well, because you're putting the property up for sale. They know they're going to get evicted anyway in all probability, and maybe you're offering them some kind of compensation that's appealing to them, and so they voluntarily sign an N11 that they will leave. But what happens again if they don't leave? You say, well, they agreed to, they have to. Well, nobody has to do what they say they're going to do, unfortunately, in our society, and that's why we have courts. But if you get an N11 signed by the tenant and they don't move out, and you go through the courts, here again, 4 to 6 month process to get the tenant out. And in the meantime, the transaction has called for a close and the seller's promised vacant possession, and he's in breach. Well, here too the Act gives you a provision, but now instead of an L2, it's an L3. I think they sometimes just bombard us with complications, because if you screw up, none of it works and you're back to square one again. But you can file with the board an L3. And an L3 is an application, again, for eviction. And you can do it up to 30 days after the date that they were supposed to leave, but you can do it anytime before. So when you get the N11 signed by the tenant, you can file with the board your L3 for an eviction. I should mention one thing. Some landlords, because the possibility of getting a bad tenant, have made a requirement at the time you sign a lease that you sign an N11 voluntarily leave the date out. The landlord fills it in when he's got a bad tenant and says, I've got an agreement right here. And the courts say if it was done at the time of signing the lease, it's unenforceable. So you can use the N11 if you get a voluntary agreement between yourself and the tenant, or an N12 if you're notifying them that they're going to be evicted because the buyer needs it, or you can use a N13. I want to caution you about the N13 though. N13 is you're evicting the tenant because you're going to change the use of the building. Maybe it's a triplex, but the one unit used to be a commercial unit in the front. You want to convert it back to a commercial unit, so it's not going to be a residential unit any longer. But it's often for renovation. And in order to use an N13, you've got to list the scope of renovations, and you've got to provide building permits unless you're under order by some municipal authority or the fire department or something like that to do that work. And you got to give the tenant a 120-day notice instead of, you have to give them a 120-day notice instead of 60-day notice. And after the work is done, they have the right to move back in at pretty much the same, very, very minimal increase in rent in spite of how much work you've done. So be very, very careful. If your plan is to do a lot of renovations and then jack it up to market rent, and you're counting on that tenant having moved on and got someplace else, they've got up to 12 months to file a complaint with the board if you don't provide them the unit back at substantially the same rent. And I want to mention that the danger, if the tenant decides to challenge you and take you to court, is that it can be extremely expensive. The courts can have the option of charging you up to $50,000 if you're an individual, or up to $250,000 if you're a corporation. So if you happen to own your properties in the name, for example, of a numbered company, it can be very, very expensive if it's not done properly. I want to caution you to do a couple of things if you are the seller or if you're representing the seller. On the agreement of purchase and sale, you want a clause in there that states that on behalf of the beneficial owner, the seller agrees to serve the prerequisite notice to the tenant requiring him to vacate. Then you should say, however, the seller does not warrant that the tenant will in fact vacate. And then you need to say, in the event that the tenant does not vacate, the buyer agrees to close the transaction and assume the tenant. And then you need to add an indemnification clause so that if the buyer actually doesn't move in with himself or his immediate family and is sued, he indemnifies the seller and the realtor from any damages or fines that could occur because of his lack of following through and discretion. Be very, very careful when you do this. Follow the rules right. You can protect your seller and not get in a situation where the seller can get sued and you can as well. I hope that makes sense. I want to thank you very much for joining me in this video. I'll talk to you again next week.